Sir Thomas was to return in November, and his eldest son had duties to call him earlier home. The approach of September brought tidings. I'm Ellen.
And I'm Harriet, and this is Reading Jane Austen.
This week we're looking at chapters 12 to 16 of Mansfield Park. Let's start with your 100-word summary.
Okay, well, this is what I had. The arrival of Tom's friend Yates means there are 5 couples for an impromptu ball. Yates gets everyone, except Edmund, excited about amateur theatricals. After arguing about choice of play, they agree on lovers' vows. Henry, as Frederick, wants Maria to be Agatha and encourages Julia to play Amelia. Julia is upset and withdraws from the play. Rushworth will be Count Cassel, and Mary agrees to play Amelia, but there is nobody for Anhalt. When Fanny says she can't play the cottager's wife, Mrs. Norris accuses her of ingratitude, but Mary is nice to her. Edmund agrees to play Anhalt.
I didn't get anything like that amount in. Tom's friend Mr. Yates inspires Tom, his sisters and Henry Crawford with a desire to act, and Tom immediately starts creating a theatre. Edmund objects, believing rightly that his father would not approve, but Tom overrules him. Lover's Vows is finally chosen, but it has no part for Julia and no male partner for Mary Crawford. Tom offers to invite a neighbour to play opposite Mary. Edmund decides to take the role, explaining to Fanny that it is the only way of containing Tom's plans. Fanny feels it is done out of concern for Mary and is a betrayal of Edmund's expressed principles.
Okay, so you got a lot more detail in there.
Well, you got the relations of the people. I'm focusing on the moral objections.
Well, I know we're mostly going to be talking about the theatricals in this episode, but just before we do, I wanted to touch on the impromptu ball that happens in chapter 16. It's actually the first time we get a sense of seeing Fanny actively taking enjoyment in physicality. You know, we know she rode the grey pony and then the horse Edmund got, and we assume she enjoyed those rides as well as getting the health benefits from them. But here it says that even though there were only 5 couple, it had been a very happy one to Fanny through 4 dances, and she was quite grieved to be losing even a quarter of an hour. So I think this is the first time we see her just genuinely having fun. It's possibly the one and only time it happens in the entire book.
Yes.
Oh, no, maybe not. I think we see her having fun at the proper ball later.
I mean, I think she had a bit of fun when they were walking in the wilderness before she got tired.
True, yeah, true.
But she's the opposite of Elizabeth.
I think you wanted to talk about the theatricals?
The big point I wanted to make about the theatricals was the objections to them.
Yeah.
And right from the start, Edmund says, no, we can't have them. Sir Thomas would not have wanted it, which turns out to be absolutely true. And he gives 2 reasons why Sir Thomas wouldn't have wanted it. First of all, he doesn't think they should start creating a theatre out of the billiard room. They shouldn't sort of fiddle with his house, whereas Tom feels as the heir, he wouldn't want to hurt the house because it's going to be his one day.
Yeah.
He sort of hints that
at
Edmund. And then the second reason that Edmund says that Thomas wouldn't want it was he wouldn't want his daughters acting. But I'm going to be talking about this in a lot more detail when we come to the historical section of this episode.
These chapters are where I've actually recently changed my views on Fanny. And I don't mean I've changed from liking her to disliking her. I've just changed my perspective on her behaviour in these chapters. Because for a long time, the way I saw the theatricals were Fanny and Edmund disapprove of them. Edmund gives way, but Fanny stands by her principles. Yay, Fanny.
Yes.
Go, Fanny, for not letting yourself be forced into doing something that's against your principles. But when I looked at it more closely this time, Fanny is not actually refusing to act because of her principles. Fanny has a visceral, I cannot act reaction. She doesn't in any way attempt to contain or prevent or block the theatricals. Julia withdraws completely. Fanny won't act. It's an emotional reaction. in some ways, even before the play is chosen, she's quite interested because she's never seen a play.
Well, that's where you get that perfect passage of Fanny worrying about she doesn't want to do it, but should she do it for them? Does she even say, acting is wrong, I mustn't act in this bad play? I don't think there's anything of that sort. But she had more than fears of her own perseverance to remove. She had begun to feel undecided as to what she ought to do, and as she walked round the room her doubts were increasing. Was she right in refusing what was so warmly asked, so strongly wished for? What might be so essential to a scheme on which some of those to whom she owed the greatest complacence had set their hearts? Was it not ill nature, selfishness, and a fear of exposing herself? And could Edmund's judgment, would his persuasion of Sir Thomas's disapprobation of the whole, be enough to justify her in a determined denial in spite of all the rest?
But I think another key point is the next sentence. It would be so horrible to her to act that she was inclined to suspect the truth and purity of her own scruples. So I think what we've got here is, whereas I've always thought of this as Fanny standing up for principle, no, it's not. It's Fanny refusing to do something because she just feels she can't do it. And under incredible pressure, and this of course is a foreshadowing of what will happen with Henry Crawford. So I guess what we do see is Fanny, her main actions being mostly negative, but they're so believable for her character. And as you said, that debating with herself as to whether she should be refusing to do this thing that will make everyone else so happy, which of course is an argument that gets put up to her with Henry Crawford's proposal,
yes,
that it will make everyone happy if she accepts him.
I hadn't thought of that as the parallel, but I mean, I had thought of that as a classic passage about Fanny, and it's that sort of thing that makes me not forgive, but be prepared to overlook the other things Jane Austen does, the ones where I was thinking she's trying to say Fanny is good. She wants us to believe all the way through that Fanny is very loving, which I don't think is quite Fanny. Fanny is too self-conscious. You know, the sort of person whose heart goes out to somebody. They don't care what anyone thinks.
Which, of course, is exactly... This is perhaps one of Mary Crawford's nicest moments in the entire book, is the bit where she can't believe Mrs. Norris has said what she said to Fanny, and her immediate reaction, it says, it's either here or somewhere else, the really good feelings by which she was almost entirely governed. She just responds immediately, and not just to sit by Fanny, but to talk to Fanny and to try and bring her out and distract her. It's a lovely action by Mary Crawford.
Jane Austen will say this sort of thing about Fanny. She's talking about how Julia walked hastily out of the room, leaving awkward feelings to more than one, but exciting small compassion in any except Fanny, who had been a quiet auditor of the whole, and who could not think of her as under the agitations of jealousy without great pity. Well, what we've got there is she's telling us Fanny was a great watcher of people. She knew what they were feeling.
Yeah.
But we're not given her feelings of pity for Julia. We're not told what she thought.
Yeah.
And it's that kind of statement of saying how lovely Fanny was without giving you her thoughts that I feel almost makes people think of her as a prig. You're told, oh, Fanny did the right thing, rather than going through something like that passage where she's to and fro, what should I feel? This Fanny, who is so confused about her emotions, who has this determination to be good. Later on, perhaps I'll be talking about it in terms of this phrase. I think Lionel Trilling got it from somewhere else, saying she had a grace of difficulty, which is what I see as so much to be admired in Fanny.
That it's not easy for her, but she always tries to do the right thing.
Yes, whereas someone like Elizabeth Bennet has a grace of ease.
Yeah.
Doing the right thing comes completely straightforward. Whereas to Fanny, she has to think it all through and worry about it. And that's one of the things I like about her, which is why I dislike it when Jane Austen says, oh, her soft heart responded to this, when Fanny wasn't like that. Fanny went through things with difficulty. but she still felt genuine pity
Yeah.
and concern for Julia.
Yeah.
But the second point I really want to make is I don't think we're given enough explanation of Fanny being so appalled when Edmund says he'll act Anhalt. She thinks he's doing it entirely for Mary Crawford, and she says to be acting after all his objections so just and so public, after all that she had heard him say and seen him look and known him to be feeling. Well, we don't get any of that. All we get is right at the beginning, where he says he doesn't want to act. So we don't know.
We've heard him talk to Tom about what a terrible choice Lover's Vows is.
Yes.
And how inappropriate it is.
Yes.
So that's presumably what Fanny's talking about.
I suppose the thing that I can't see is that Edmund has said, I won't take part in it. Whereas what he actually chooses to do is to try and contain the problem. Even if there wasn't Mary Crawford in the case, he might well have chosen to act and have a say in what's happening, rather than have Tom expanding it.
How much was his agreement to act because of Mary Crawford? How much was principle and how much was personal? One of the people who wrote Talking of Jane Austen, and I can't remember whether it was Sheila K. Smith or G.B. Stern, is really critical of Edmund at this time, and she feels that his decision to take part in the play, essentially she feels it just shows he doesn't have the courage of his convictions. But as you were saying, the reasons he gives to Fanny are basically good and valid reasons.
And also they relate almost entirely to his vision of the reason his father disapproved.
Yeah, it's all about stopping them bringing an outsider in and stopping Tom riding around the country and inviting everyone to come and watch it, and potentially trying to limit the amount of work they're doing on building the theatre. But the thing is, what we don't actually know is how much of this, if any, is just a rationalisation because he wants to join in with Mary. So what you've got, as I see it, is you've got the damage control. I can exert more management over this if I'm part of it. Then you've got the I feel bad for Mary having to do this with someone she doesn't know very well. And then you've also got, and this will give me a chance to spend more time with Mary, which obviously is not something he says.
Well, I think there's also in there, I don't want Mary to be acting this scene with someone else.
Yeah.
What I tend to think is his genuine feeling that Tom has got to be stopped.
Yeah.
Fits in so beautifully with that, that he can't say, and I don't think we can say, which is the stronger prompting.
Well, see, I think that's what's important. We don't know because we're never told. I don't think it is, but you could say all that other stuff is just a rationalisation because he wants to spend time with Mary. You could say that everything he says is true and wanting to spend time with Mary doesn't come into it. We just don't know because we're not given any of his inner thoughts. With Fanny, we got that agonising overnight. Should she, shouldn't she? She felt bad about it. We know exactly where Fanny stands. We have no real idea where Edmund stands except by what he actually says to Fanny, and we have to extrapolate from that. And Fanny extrapolates maybe being a little bit unfair.
I suppose one of the things I feel is that we have no evidence that Edmund wants to act with Mary. What he wants is to stop anyone else acting with her.
Okay.
And I think we have no evidence of anything else.
I think he genuinely doesn't want to act, but I think there could, even if he doesn't admit it to himself, be a bit of a bonus that this will allow him to spend a bit more time with Mary and maybe talk in a different way than they have before.
I'm not convinced we have any evidence for that.
And that actually leads to my other question, which is they can be intimate with the Crawfords and not with these young men in the neighbourhood who presumably they must have gone to dinners with them and to balls with them. They've known the Crawfords only a few months. Yes, they live only walking distance away, but they've known these other young men all their lives potentially.
Yes.
It seems odd that it's so completely okay to have the Crawfords because they've been more intimate with them than everyone else, but only for such a short period of time.
Well, I think we have to leave that as odd.
Yes.
Because I don't think we can explain it. It was Jane Austen put it there.
Yeah. The scenes in this where they're choosing a play and choosing the parts, there is so much naked self-interest coming through in all those discussions, and it is just so funny and so believable.
Yes, with all of them trying to get the right thing from themselves.
It says, no piece could be proposed that did not supply somebody with a difficulty, and on one side or the other it was a continual repetition of, oh no, that will never do, let us have no ranting tragedies, too many characters, not a tolerable woman's part in the play. Anything but that, my dear Tom. It would be impossible to fill it up. One could not expect anybody to take such a part. Nothing but buffoonery from beginning to end. That might do perhaps, but for the low parts. If I must give my opinion, I have always thought it the most insipid play in the English language. I do not wish to make objections. I shall be happy to be of any use, but I think we could not choose worse. It's easy to think, because Mansfield Park has such a serious heroine and does actually have all these serious ideas being presented about education, it's easy to forget just how funny some sections of it are. And this section where they're talking about the theatre and where they're choosing the play and choosing the parts.
Yes.
It is so funny.
Yes.
Because every character is behaving in a way that is true to how they've been presented, and there is so much self-interest and self-centeredness and determination to put on a polite front. It is just really funny.
And enjoyable for Fanny.
Yes.
Who's looking at all this.
Yeah. That, in fact, leads on to another thing I was going to say, which is that I think it's in these scenes that you really start to see the full lack of intelligence of Mr. Rushworth. The almost childlike level of his mental processing.
Yeah.
I know up until now we've seen him as boring.
He's boring because he tells you how many birds he shot.
Yeah.
He tells you what a good dog he's got.
Yes.
The sort of things he'd said to Mariah were the sort of stuff that a really boring person who'd been out shooting.
So John Middleton would probably say this sort of thing.
Yes.
But here you do get a sense that he is in some ways still kind of childlike, almost.
Well, like counting up his speeches, it's like a not very bright 10-year-old, isn't it?
Yeah.
And when he says, I don't know if I like to be so fine.
Again, the subtlety of a 10-year-old.
Yes, he was a little bit like that at Southerton.
It is.
But it could be either way.
Yeah.
Retrospectively, you can see, though, that Jane Austen knew that was what he was like.
Yes. I just wanted to talk about this lengthy description of Fanny's, almost her life, of the rooms she lives in, and the fact that she's made the East Room her own, and everyone has come to accept that. But, we get this quite lengthy description of her books and her geraniums that she's growing.
Yes.
But it does also fit into this idea of Fanny as Cinderella. And even though she's not down in the kitchens, in the cinders, and she does have this space.
She's still got a fire that's not working.
Yeah, it's this lovely description of the space she's made and what it shows of her character, but it also, I think, emphasises that she is not a Miss Bertram. She is still basically a Cinderella in this family, with Mrs. Norris as the evil stepmother, Mariah and Julia filling the slot of evil stepsisters, but not actually being evil stepsisters.
And then, of course, you've got Edmund being the fairy godmother.
Yeah.
So you get the inappropriate ending where she marries the fairy godmother.
Yes, where you think at one point that Henry Crawford is going to be the handsome prince who she will marry, and then no, she marries the fairy godmother.
Yes.
Which is a fun twist by Jane Austen.
Which is her making her own statement about principles and behaving well.
So, what was your favourite sentence from this section?
Well, my favourite sentence I chose because this is what I remembered most from all the reading. And it also fits in with something that I was reading in Jane Austen's letters, where her brother was in the process of reading Mansfield Park. And she wrote, Henry, which is her brother, admires H. Crawford, I mean properly, as a clever, pleasant man. And this is the one I got, which I thought is that where he says, I could be fool enough at this moment to undertake any character that ever was written, from Shylock to Richard III, down to the singing hero of a farce in his scarlet coat and cocked hat. And that's really a sentence, but I'll read the next one. I feel as if I could be anything or everything, as if I could rant and storm or sigh or cut capers in any tragedy or comedy in the English language. It is such an entertaining sentence. I mean, he's just talking away, but to listen to him, he's a really intelligent man, just pulling in all these references, which are not obscure references. He just sees that they fit together.
My favourite sentence, it's in the scene with the impromptu ball where Fanny has been hoping Tom will ask her to dance, but he says he doesn't want to, and then Mrs. Norris wants to get him to play cards. He says, I'm sorry, but I'm just about to dance with Fanny. He doesn't say, Fanny, will you dance with me? He says, Fanny and I were about to dance. Yeah. And then after he's on the dance floor with Fanny, he complains about what Mrs. Norris had done and says, it raises my spleen more than anything to have the pretence of being asked, of being given a choice, and at the same time addressed in such a way as to oblige one to do the very thing, whatever it be. And then says, if I hadn't luckily thought of standing up with you, I would have been stuck playing cards. I just thought that was so funny. Very Tom. Just the complete blindness of how he's completely describing his own conduct, not just Mrs. Norris's.
Well, again, very character revealing.
Yes.
But it's comedy. The whole thing is comedy.
Yeah. The character we're talking about today is Tom Bertram. In a lot of ways, he actually comes across as quite a nice and likeable person. He's obviously very good company. It even says...
Yes, because people wouldn't put up with him in all those watering places.
But what I like is that what we actually see on 2 occasions is his ability to be self-deprecating and to laugh at himself. First of all, in the conversation about women being out, and he tells those 2 stories, which he doesn't cut a particularly proud figure.
Where he made the mistakes with the girls who hadn't come out. Yes.
But then also in the chapters we've been looking at where he was talking to Edmund about, I think it is a good idea to put the play on now because it's an anxious time for my mother. And then they both look over and Lady Bertram has been asleep. And he says, by Jove, this won't do, cried Tom, throwing himself into a chair with a hearty laugh. To be sure, my dear mother, your anxiety, I was unlucky there. He can basically pick himself up and keep going. He's very optimistic. But of course, the counter side to that is he never thinks to the future. He always thinks things will sort themselves out. There's that beautiful piece earlier in the book when Sir Thomas has spoken to him very gravely about how his extravagance has meant Edmund for 10, 20 years, perhaps the rest of his life, will suffer a loss of income. He is, in fact, somewhat chastened by what Sir Thomas says, but then, where it says, Tom listened with some shame and some sorrow, but escaping as quickly as possible, could soon with cheerful selfishness reflect, firstly, that he had not been half so much in debt as some of his friends, secondly, that his father had made a most tiresome piece of work of it, and thirdly, that the future incumbent, whoever he might be, would, in all probability, die very soon. So he just thinks everything will work out. He's quite selfish, which completely comes through in that bit I read out for my favourite sentence, where he's criticising Aunt Norris and everything he says actually applies just as much to himself. Like everyone else, when it comes to the play, he's very driven by self-interest.
Well, no, up to a point, you'd have to say, and I'm not particularly defending him, that he was the one who said, right, I won't be as difficult, I will take a minor part.
But then he immediately goes on to suggest a play he's already suggested multiple times.
Yes, but when he suggests Lover's Vows, he is not taking a major part.
No. One other thing in favour of him, when Mary Crawford is meeting him, with the advantage of being tied up from much gaming at present by a promise to his father. It's not clear whether he's not gambling at all or whether he's just being less extravagant, but he has promised his father and he's standing by that promise.
Well, I suppose the picture I get with him is, for one thing, he's obviously company mad. There's nothing like enough people at Mansfield. That's why he's off all the time. He goes down to these watering places.
Yes.
And instead of in London where you see people at the shops, at the watering places there's lots of people, like Bath, having concerts and balls and things like that. But also they're walking around. Possibly sometimes they're even going swimming. He's basically goes into a group of company and is happy there, but he's certainly not back at Mansfield saving money or looking after the estate. Well, he comes back for the shooting, and the reason he probably is prepared to stay at Mansfield in spite of the weather is because there are enough people there. I mean, the Crawfords were not enough to hold him the first time, but once he's got Mr. Yates and the play. There was one thing that made me feel he was a bit more mercenary. We think of him as not worrying about money, not thinking about his inheritance. But when Mr. Yates has been describing what happened at Ecclesford, he comes in with this little joke. Now, in that, there's just that little phrase, well, the jointure may comfort him. And what that means is he immediately thinks, when the grandmother dies, more money. I suppose it's not much worse than saying, did she leave you anything in a will? But it seems to me a little bit worse. It's just the property owner who is now thinking in terms of somebody with a property.
I guess it's also all part of the slightly tasteless way they're talking about the death of the grandmother, that she was 200 miles off and couldn't they have just kept quiet about it for just 3 days?
Yes, I know.
It's all just a little bit tacky.
Yes, but that particular one made me feel this is Tom Bertram, the future landowner, talking. But then the one thing I did rather like, the way Tom turns round and starts trying to persuade Fanny, and he says, do not be so shamefaced. You'll do it very well. Every allowance will be made for you. We do not expect perfection. You must get a brown gown and a white apron and a mob cap, and we must make you a few wrinkles and a little of the crow's foot at the corners of your eyes, and you will be a very proper little old woman. I mean, it's as though she's a child. That's the side of Tom that was always, when he saw something pretty in a shop, thought, oh, Fanny might like that.
That's the other thing with Tom's relationship with Fanny. It says when she was a child that he bought her presents and laughed at her. But then in the stuff where she's looking around the East Room, she's got all these work boxes that have been gifts mostly from Tom. So the picture I'm getting there of Tom is that he's absent-mindedly fond of her. He knows nothing about what she's like as a person. He buys her these gifts, and they're probably quite nice work boxes, but it's always the same thing because he doesn't remember that he bought her a work box last year.
Yes.
So I said I do see him as selfish, yes, and thoughtless, yes, but not a bad person. There's no malice in him, I think.
On the other hand, there's not much kindness. There's only very superficial kindness.
There's superficial, absent-minded kindness when it doesn't cost him anything in terms of time and effort.
Yes.
He'll be kind. As we were preparing for this, we had an email from a listener called Medha, and I'm sorry I've probably mispronounced your name, most of which I'm going to, I think, refer to a bit later, because she raised something about Lady Bertram. I thought she was funny but extremely selfish, and it suddenly struck me, Tom, more than any of the others, is like Lady Bertram. He doesn't have her laziness. He's a very active person, but he has this same blinkered selfishness. He doesn't see his innate selfishness in the same way that Lady Bertram will lie on her sofa and say, oh yes, it was very bad for Fanny to be out in the sun, without having actually done anything to prevent Fanny from having to be out in the sun. Last time when we talked about Maria and Julia, and the time before when we talked about Mary, and we talked about how in all of these characters we're seeing the lack of education in principle being what's gone wrong for them. We don't get that as overtly for Tom.
What's Mansfield going to be like when it falls into his hands?
Well, he's a bit of a lightweight.
He isn't the right person to inherit. He's never going to be a decent member of Parliament. He's never going to turn up properly as a magistrate.
But in the background, you do get the story of maybe not quite reform of the rake, because I think it's unfair to call him a rake.
Oh, I don't think he's a rake.
But you get the same story as you had with Marianne Dashwood of being redeemed by illness. He gets sick and he recovers, and he's come to reflect on his past behaviour and become a much more sober and serious person. At the end, it says, Tom gradually regained his health without regaining the thoughtlessness and selfishness of his previous habits. He was the better for ever for his illness. He had suffered and he had learned to think. two advantages that he had never known before, and the self-reproach arising from the deplorable event in Wimpole Street, to which he felt himself accessory by all the dangerous intimacy of his unjustifiable theatre, made an impression on his mind which at the age of 26, with no want of sense or good companions, was durable in its happy effects. He became what he ought to be, useful to his father, steady and quiet, and not merely living for himself.
I don't believe it.
Okay. Well, I suppose with Marianne we got a little bit afterwards of her talking about how she was going to be a better person. With him, that is literally all we get, that paragraph.
When we're trying to say, can we believe it?
Yeah.
Because, my feeling is, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. We're not shown it because, of course, after the theatricals, he disappears off stage. We only really hear of him after that. In between Mariah's wedding and Tom getting sick at Newmarket, we have no idea what he's been doing. I'm sure out in the Jane Austen fan fiction community, someone somewhere has probably written the story of Tom Bertram.
For the historical section this episode, I'm going to be looking at, on one hand, the Georgian theatre and Lovers' Vows, and secondly, what was the basis of Fanny and Edmund's disapproval of acting. Now, this is just a tiny little quote taken off the internet about what the theatre of the period was like. All performances would have taken place on the forestage, in close quarters with the audience. Behind this, the stage would be elaborately set with perspective backcloths, creating the illusion of distance in a variety of settings. So what you had was the place lit very well by candles where the acting took place, and then as much as they could spend on a very fancy backdrop, often with different scenes coming down. We're not sure how much that happens with Mansfield Park. Right from the start, we have Tom Bertram when they're still thinking about doing it quite modestly. He says a few yards of green baize for a curtain, and perhaps that may be enough. Oh, quite enough, cried Mr. Yates, with only just a side wing or two run up, doors in flat, and 3 or 4 scenes to be let down. Nothing more would be necessary. And so what he's going to have is, on the actual stage where they're acting, you're going to have walls put down that have doors in, so it can be an indoor scene if necessary, and the doors can open and they go in and out. And that will be where it's lit and where they'll speak out to the audience. But behind that, you'll have scenes, and before very long, they're busy planning what scenes they're going to need. And by the time Sir Thomas comes back, a scene painter has been ordered down from London, and he's splashing the floors of various rooms with his scene painting. So basically, the Georgian theatre is what Jane Austen knew about and what they're trying to reproduce as well as they can at Mansfield. I think we can assume that Jane Austen thought that most of her readers would know the plot of Lovers' Vows.
Yeah.
It was an adaptation by the English playwright Mrs. Inchbold of a German play called Das Kind der Liebe, which means the child of love. It had been around for quite a long time. It was performed frequently, not just in London, but in all sorts of provincial theatres, and obviously there were plenty of bound copies of it around. In Lovers' Vows, we have examples of 2 popular styles of female actress, the tragic heroine and the hoyden. The tradition that these 2 really goes all the way back to Shakespeare. On the one hand, there were the tragic parts, like Cleopatra and Lady Macbeth, with opportunities for drama and a great display of emotion. And in Lovers' Vows, these opportunities are given to the character Agatha, a classic woman betrayed. She was seduced in her teens by the Baron and then abandoned to bring up her son alone. She has been separated from him for some time, but they encounter one another again. they have impassioned scenes of reconciliation, and she tells him about his parentage. Later on, they confront the Baron, and after all sorts of things, there was a happy ending when Agatha finally marries her seducer, the Baron, who is conveniently a widower.
Yes. I've actually just read the play for the first time. I'd got a rough idea of what it was about just from context and from footnotes in the book. But now that I've read it, some things make so much more sense. I hadn't realised from the book, because everything about Yates wanting to be the Baron so he could rant nicely, I had pictured the evil Baron who had seduced poor Agatha and left her with child and gone off and had his own life. I didn't realise that he marries her in the end. I didn't realise that he is actually remorseful, and he has in fact asked Anne Hults to find Agatha for him. So he's not the cartoon villain I'd pictured.
Yes. The second basic Shakespearean part is this pert, quick-answering character like Viola, like Beatrice, like Rosalind. And some of these parts involve cross-dressing. And, of course, in Shakespeare's time, these parts were played by boys.
So you had a boy actor playing the part of a woman who was dressing up as a boy.
Yes. So when you had women suddenly, after the Restoration, coming in and taking the female parts in Shakespeare, and right up to the period we're talking about now, it became absolutely standard to have what they called breeches parts. On the other hand, you also have this General Hoyden part. Sometimes she's called the Roaring Girl, who's not necessarily cross-dressing. She's not necessarily quite as bold as all that, but she certainly speaks out, and she tends to speak against the female tradition of modest behaviour. And this is what we have with Amelia. Amelia is the Baron's daughter. The Baron wanted her to marry Count Cassel, but in fact she set her heart on this clergyman Anhalt, and she has this scene, which we hear plenty about in Mansfield Park, of where she proposes marriage to him in this pert sort of way.
Well, yeah, she effectively declares her love before he's declared his love.
Yes, in a flirtatious manner. So she fits the other character, the Hoyden girl.
One of the other things that makes much more sense to me now that I've read the play is Count Cassel, because he's actually something of a fop, and that totally explains Mr. Rushworth's obsession with his fancy costumes. And the fop was also kind of a standard part in theatre of the time.
You can find earlier fops in Shakespeare, but by the time you get to the Restoration, there's almost a fop in every play.
Yeah. And also, some of his speeches are really very wordy, and it's clear that there's just no way Mr. Rushworth could possibly ever remember them. I did find it quite interesting to read the play. I don't think I particularly want to read it again. It was not as terrible as I'd expected, but it was not great either.
I actually once saw a performance of it, and I thought this is like a soap opera.
Very like a soap opera.
That is my total recollection of what I thought. Yeah. We now come to the question of why Jane Austen and Edmund and Fanny appear to be so disapproving of the theatricals at Mansfield. Fanny could never have been easy in joining a scheme which, considering only her uncle, she must condemn altogether. Well, for getting on for 100 years, academics have felt that it isn't just that Sir Thomas would disapprove, that is simply not a sufficient explanation. Now, this belief that there is some other reason for disapproving of acting goes back to, well, the very classic article by Lionel Trilling from the 1950s. And he argued that the basis of Sir Thomas's and Edmund's and Fanny's objection to acting was a belief in the immorality of impersonation or of acting a role. He doesn't really give any evidence that this idea was around anywhere else. There's certainly no evidence in the text, but he doesn't even give any evidence where you might find it, say, in sermons or in essays of the period. If it exists, he didn't produce it. It's known from Jane Austen's papers that when she was a child, her family did acting, that when she was visiting her nieces and nephews, she often helped them with plays and dressing up games. Deirdre Le Fay found in the letters something that hints that at some stage she saw an amateur production of Lovers' Vows, so she didn't disapprove of it. And yet acting as impersonation has really been taken on board by academic critics ever since, and other people who are trying to explain Mansfield Park to a wider public, they also take notice of it. In a recent book called 30 Myths About Jane Austen, a description of the whole incident of Lovers' Vows ends up by saying, Fanny Price, who sees acting as a form of duplicitous disguise and self-deception. But is Jane Austen actually suggesting that the act of impersonation is immoral? When she deals with moral issues elsewhere in the book, she uses the word principle, but she nowhere applies this to acting in these chapters. She nowhere makes any suggestion that acting would violate any principle except the obligation to obey their father. The word she uses to describe the problem with the acting is the word decorum, which turns up quite a number of times. Right at the beginning, Edmund makes it clear that his objection to acting is not a universal but a class one. Acting would undermine the decorum of the gentry. When he's challenged by his brother with going to the theatre, he replies, true to see real acting, good hardened real acting, but I would hardly walk from this room to the next to look at the raw efforts of those who have not been bred to the trade, a set of gentlemen and ladies who have the disadvantages of education and decorum, there's that word again, to struggle through. And this seems to imply that he doesn't see acting as wicked. If acting was wicked, he would be wrong to go to the theatre and encourage it.
Yeah.
It's definitely the decorum and the class thing that he is talking about. All along he maintains that performing a play to an audience would violate the decorum that Sir Thomas believes should characterise his household. Edmund says to Maria he would never wish his grown-up daughters to be acting plays. His sense of decorum is strict, but he's talking always about the behaviour of a particular class and of the kind of household that Sir Thomas wants. I think the picture we get is he would have been very fussy about his daughters. I'd be pretty sure he wouldn't have let his daughters go out hunting. He wouldn't have allowed rough games like hide and seek and so on when he had a house party. Probably, though it didn't come in for another couple of years, when the waltz appeared, I think he would have been pretty sure to say that his daughters must not dance the waltz. There were families that would have gone in for theatricals, and there were families that wouldn't, and the Bertrams wouldn't. I mean, much more than what happens at the Bennets or Sir John Middleton.
Sir John Middleton, I think, would be totally up for getting the young people to put on scenes.
Yes, that Sir Thomas would not want to happen at Mansfield. So what we've got here, I feel, is Jane Austen, who's got lovely memories of the things that can go wrong with theatricals.
Yeah.
She wants to set up a comic interlude where this can happen, and she's created a comic situation where you've got this pompous father with his decorous household, where everything is seemly, where nobody does anything that could be laughed at or criticised. He goes away. What happens? His children all start doing what he doesn't want them to do, hoping to get it all done before he comes back. And another comedy scene, he comes back in the middle of it, just before they've been able to hide it all away. As you said earlier, these are funny.
Yes.
But I think the point I'm wanting to make, though, is that Jane Austen can treat most of this as funny.
Yeah.
Because in her view, and she assumes in the views of her readers, the actors are only breaking the rather pompous rules of decorum that have been laid down by Sir Thomas.
But how do we reconcile that there's never any questioning or challenging of Sir Thomas's views on this? Jane Austen's family wasn't in this point of view.
This is when we come back to your stuff about family. They are supposed to do what Sir Thomas tells them. They are there in lieu of Sir Thomas. Edmund and Tom are looking after his house for him. They're supposed to be making sure that everything at Mansfield goes on the way he would have liked it. But what they were doing was not in itself evil or sinful. And so the human comedy of it is open to her talents.
Yeah. I think maybe there is a sense that they are entering slightly dangerous waters for their own personal safety. This allows Edmund and Mary to talk in a way that perhaps they wouldn't normally, but more importantly with Maria and Henry, it even allows physical contact that goes beyond what would have been appropriate. But as you're saying, it's decorum, it's behaviour.
And if we're thinking about decorum, I suppose one of the things I find interesting is that it's class behaviour. It's so strongly with Edmund, gentry. Fanny may praise Mansfield for its decorum, but that doesn't mean Jane Austen disapproved of lively, witty households who went in for amateur theatrical performances. In fact, to provide a proper setting, to exploit the comedy of her lifelong observations of what went on at theatricals, it made sense to set them in a very prim and proper household with an absent father.
Whereas last time, not all of the adaptations have the scene at Southerton, all of them have the theatricals. But it is really, really fascinating to see what elements they include and don't include. The 1983 BBC version with Sylvester Latouzel and Nicholas Farrell, as I've said before, this is the most respectful of the adaptations. So it does have, before the theatricals, the impromptu ball with Tom dancing with Fanny. When it comes to the theatricals, you have all the scenes with Tom and Edmund talking about it. You have the scene with Mrs. Norris being mean to Fanny and Mary supporting her, although in this case Julia supports her as well. They have the scene of Edmund coming to Fanny's room to talk about his decision to take part. One thing they do leave out, interestingly, is Mary immediately says she will ask Mrs. Grant to play the part. So you don't have that scene that we both liked so much from the book that really brings out Fanny's character of her worrying about was she doing the right thing by refusing to act, which I would imagine they cut because that is such an internal monologue scene that you couldn't really portray it effectively, so they left it out. This one maybe doesn't have as much comedy in the book because it doesn't have the arguments about what play to do.
Yes.
Now, the 1999 version with Frances O'Connor and Johnny Lee Miller. For a start, it changes the background because Tom and Yates met at a theatre in London and they were putting on Lovers' Vows. In this, it's being presented as a much more scandalous play, so Henry's the only one who's even ever heard of it. There's no discussion about putting on another play. It's just an immediate decision to put on Lovers' Vows, and there are no casting arguments either. Mary simply says, I wish to play Amelia. There's no other casting discussion at all.
Really?
And then they actually combine the two scenes in Fanny's room. So you have Edmund and Fanny sitting in Fanny's room talking about how it's a bad idea. Then Mary comes in and asks Fanny to read lines with her. And while Fanny is reading the lines to her, Mary is being very seductive. At one point she even runs her finger along Fanny's back. And then Edmund just stands up and says he will be in the play. So they've completely removed any sense of Edmund deciding to do it because of wanting to
exclude outsiders.
Yes, and maybe exert a little bit more control over it. It's purely he's convinced when he sees Mary basically seducing Fanny.
He wants to be there.
I think that is the implication you're meant to take. You don't actually know who's playing what. You don't really know much about the play. But Julia is evidently playing a part, unspecified.
They simply do not want to upset the play with the unpleasant part of Julia being upset and walking out.
I'm guessing it was as much as anything a time constraints thing. And then we have the 2007 version with Billie Piper and Blake Ritson. And it also significantly compresses this early stage of the play, but it does make some different decisions. First of all, there is no Mr. Yates in this version. It is Tom who has just come back from the abortive attempt to put on the play of Lovers' Vows, and
Yes.
it is Tom who has most of Yates's lines about an old woman 200 miles away and if only it could have been suppressed for 3 days.
That sounds to me perfectly
Yes.
legitimate. It's just that it's funnier if it's Mr. Yates.
Yeah. As with 1999, they completely skip over any issue of trying to decide what play to do. We've suddenly jumped from Tom didn't get to be in this play with his friends to, and we're putting it on here. And like 1999, they completely omit any clash between Mariah and Julia as to who plays Agatha. That part has gone to Mariah, and Julia seems to be still quite happily involved in some unnamed other part.
Yes.
They've also completely omitted the issue of Fanny taking part because Julia just says to Fanny, does she mind not having a part to play? And Fanny just basically lays it out in black and white for the audience in case we didn't get it from the Tom and Edmund discussion that Sir Thomas would not approve and Fanny can't afford to displease him.
Nothing about Fanny and sort of morals and principles and...
Well, there's been no sense that Fanny actually separated herself from it. The impression you get is that everyone else got the parts and there was nothing left for Fanny, and Julia quite nicely says, do you mind? And Fanny says, no, I don't mind. And then, just after this, Edmund calls Fanny aside and asks for her opinion because he says it's getting worse and worse. They're asking an outsider to play Anne Holt. I must play Anne Holt myself. Can you think of an alternative? And Fanny sort of says hesitatingly, I do see it's not right for Miss Crawford to act with a stranger. But before she can even finish that sentence, Edmund jumps in and says, you're right, she must be spared. So they do try and get in this idea that Edmund is trying to control it, but not as explicitly. So whereas in 1999, Edmund's decision to take part seems to have been a snap decision and driven entirely by Mary Crawford's sexuality as she reads the part with Fanny. In this case, they've tried to compress but still maintain this idea that Edmund is doing it for damage control and also to protect Mary Crawford.
Yes.
But the fact that he cuts Fanny off as she's trying to articulate some concerns does suggest that they're emphasising the I'm doing this for Mary rather than the I'm doing this to try and limit the amount of damage Tom can do and control it in a way Sir Thomas would like.
Yes.
So that's how those adaptations all treat it. With the exception of 1983, they all very, very much compress it. The sheer comedy of choosing a play, choosing parts, all the selfishness that's coming through is mostly absent.
All the stuff that G.B. Stern loved so much.
Yes. Now, you may remember way back in our first episode, when I was talking about modernisations, I was saying one that always crops up when you see lists of modernisations is a 1990 film by Whit Stillman called Metropolitan. And I said at the time that has echoes of Mansfield Park, but it's not in any meaningful way an adaptation of the book. But it does have one scene that you could say does draw somewhat directly from Mansfield Park. They're playing what they call a truth game, where if you do something wrong, your forfeit is you have to answer truthfully whatever question you are asked.
All right.
And the character who is, I think, essentially the Fanny equivalent, in that she's the most principled of them, she doesn't want to join in this game, because she says that games like this can be really dangerous and people shouldn't have to say everything about themselves. So she's very concerned about it from a moral and ethical point of view, but she's pushed into taking part. It's not the same as the play, but it does have that echo of feeling that they're doing something that is maybe moving beyond the boundaries that they should be observing. So it's unlike the adaptations, it's picking up on that side of it.
Yes.
The other two modernisations to talk about are, of course, the 2014 web series From Mansfield with Love and the D.E. Stevenson book Celia's House. From Mansfield with Love, Tom turns up with his friend Yates, an incredibly pretentious independent actor-producer. So they want to do a film that Yates has written. It's called Lover's Vows. Some of the character names are the same as the original, but in this case they get rid of the whole illegitimate child thing, and there are two couples. One is Frederick and Agatha, the other is Amelia and Anhalt.
Yes.
So they're going to make a film about this, and Ed is really opposed to it. He says the play is terrible. Everyone agrees that the script is terrible, actually. And he says we shouldn't be doing this with our fathers away. We shouldn't be associating it with the hotel. They decide to have auditions for this film. But in fact, when it comes to the women's parts, they just all end up being assigned. And in this one, Julia does basically say, not going to do this, and walks away. Edmund is still holding out against it, saying he won't do it. But then he starts to get concerned about the amount of money it's costing, and that because there's no one to play Anhalt, they're actually getting some unknown actor in who will expect to be paid. And he just thinks he will be able to exert more control if he is part of it. It does keep the comedy of it in a way that I think the direct adaptations don't, because they're trying to get through the plot. Now, the last one of the Modernisations is Celia's House. Up until this point, Celia's House has only had some sort of passing resemblances to Mansfield Park. But they decide they're going to put on a performance of scenes from A Midsummer Night's Dream. The Henry Crawford character, whose name is Oliver, is flirting with both the Maria equivalent, whose name is Edith, and the Julia character, who is called Joyce. And so in this adaptation of Midsummer Night's Dream, Edith is playing Helena and Oliver is playing Demetrius, and the man Edith is engaged to is playing Aegeus. And then the Mary Crawford equivalent, whose name is Emma, is playing Hermia, and the Edmund equivalent, whose name is Mark, is playing Lysander. So you have that relationship of characters mapping to parts in the play.
Yes.
But what is completely different is there is absolutely none of the we shouldn't be doing this.
Yes.
The other thing that's really different is that the whole thing is driven by Emma, the Mary Crawford equivalent. I think I said last time how Emma is just scheming and manipulative and selfish. And
so she is that spider.
yes, she is the spider that John Mullen was describing, that we don't see in Mary Crawford in the book.
Yeah, but obviously D.E. Stevenson did see.
Yes. Debbie, who is the Fanny equivalent, is supposed to be playing Titania, and she's quite looking forward to it. And then Emma comes to see her and says, Mark really wants to include this other person, and you don't really want to do it, do you? So you won't mind giving up Titania, will you? Ah. And of course, Debbie, having been told that this is what Mark wants, she says, oh no, of course, that's fine. But then what comes out later in the book is that was a complete lie. And in fact, she then went to Mark and told Mark that Debbie had pulled out because she got stage fright. Oh. So this is just, in my view, a completely different version of Mary Crawford from the one in the book. So it is Mansfield Park, but it's not Mansfield Park. But she is, I think, very clearly drawing on Mansfield Park, but adapting it to what she wants to do with her book. And that then leads me to, I'm going to talk just really briefly about one of the variations on Mansfield Park. I don't normally talk about the variations. These are books where either someone has retold the same story from a different perspective, which I often quite like, or they have done a what if. How would the book have played out if this thing had happened instead of that thing?
Yes.
The one I want to talk about is Lona Manning's. She's written 3 books flowing on from Mansfield Park. The first one is called A Contrary Wind. That's the only one I've read so far. Its key starting point is the play, and there are 2 things that she says what if in terms of the play. The first is what if Fanny, after being so horribly criticised by Aunt Norris, decides she can't take it anymore and she decides to leave Mansfield and become a governess.
All right.
And the other what if, and this is why the book is called A Contrary Wind, because as we know in the book, there was no contrary wind, so Sir Thomas was able to get home a bit earlier than expected. In this instance, there was a contrary wind, so he got home later.
They finished the play.
Yes. I won't go into details about what's different. I certainly enjoyed reading it. Some of the bits of it I maybe felt that's not quite how I see Mansfield Park, and I suppose the main difference I feel in it is that she, like D.E. Stevenson, sees Mary Crawford as a manipulative character.
Yes.
And I think her creation of Mary Crawford is a more interesting and complex version than the one D.E. Stevenson had. And because I haven't read the next two books in the Mansfield trilogy, I have no idea what she's going to do with the Mary Crawford character, but I'm planning to read them. But from those two what-if starting points, she's taken it off in lots of very different directions.
Yeah.
Some of them I found maybe a little less convincing than others, but I certainly found the book as a whole a really enjoyable read. But I just wanted to mention it here because, as I said, it used the theatricals as its starting point for where things go different. And things go very, very, very different after that point. You've been listening to the Reading Jane Austen podcast with me, Harriet.
And me, Ellen. In our next episode, we'll be looking at chapters 17 to 21 of Mansfield Park.
The structure of this podcast was inspired by Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Our music is Creative Commons performances of pieces Jane Austen might have listened to.
You can find us on Facebook at Reading Jane Austen and our website readingjaneausten.com.
You can email us at readingjaneausten.com or rate and review us in your podcast app. We hope you'll join us next time.